April 18, 1945, Schwarzwald, Germany. Dawn broke over the misty Black Forest as the remnants of the 254th German Infantry Regiment prepared their defenses on the outskirts of Pforzheim. Captain Werner Brecht checked his watch, convinced that the Americans would pause their advance for at least another day, giving his men time to properly fortify their positions and perhaps even launch a local counterattack. The German High Command had assured them that the approaching American units included the 761st Tank Battalion and elements of the 92nd Infantry Division, predominantly staffed with what Nazi propaganda called Roosevelt's Black Beasts, who were supposedly ineffective in combat and brutal to civilians. Neither Brecht nor the terrified townspeople hiding in their cellars could imagine how profoundly wrong these assumptions would prove to be. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how the collision between vicious racial propaganda and the everyday humanity of Black American soldiers transformed not just one German town, but the worldview of an entire generation of German citizens. The morning air was crisp, carrying the distant rumble of artillery that had become the soundtrack of impending doom for many German towns in the spring of 1945. Captain Werner Brecht, a veteran of the Eastern Front with a prominent scar running from his right temple to his jaw, surveyed what remained of his company, mostly teenagers and men in their 50s, the dregs of Germany's once mighty Wehrmacht. His regiment had been reduced to barely 300 effective fighters, armed with a hodgepodge of weapons and critically low ammunition. "They say we face the Schwarze today," muttered Sergeant Karl Müller, his weathered face showing no emotion as he used the German slur for black soldiers. At 48, Müller had fought in both world wars and had long since learned to hide his fears. "Yes," Brecht nodded, studying his outdated maps. Intelligence reports elements of the 761st Tank Battalion approaching from the southwest. They call themselves the Black Panthers. "My wife heard Dr. Goebbels' broadcast last week," said Corporal Heinrich Weber, barely 20 and trembling slightly as he checked his Mauser rifle for the third time. "He said these Negroes are primitive savages who torture prisoners and violate women, that they're barely trained and break under pressure." Brecht had heard the same broadcasts, seen the same propaganda leaflets with crude caricatures depicting Black American soldiers as jungle monsters with exaggerated features. For months, the Reich's propaganda ministry had been working overtime to terrify both soldiers and civilians about the particular threat posed by black troops. "The Reichsministerium für Volksaufklärung und Propaganda claims many things, Corporal," Brecht replied carefully. "Focus on your position and ammunition conservation. We have 38 rounds per man, no more." Just 3 kilometers away, Staff Sergeant James Washington of the 761st Tank Battalion checked his Sherman tank systems one final time before the planned advance. At 25, Washington had already seen more combat than most soldiers twice his age, having fought his way from Normandy through France, Belgium, and now into the German heartland. "How are we looking, Davis?" Washington called to his gunner. "All systems operational, Sarge," Private First Class Marcus Davis replied, his voice steady despite the tension of the coming assault. "Ammunition fully stocked, 90 rounds of 75mm, including 15 high explosive." "That's what I like to hear," Washington nodded, patting the steel hull of the Sherman they'd named Harlem Hellfighter in honor of the famed black regiment from World War I. Lieutenant Colonel T.J. Rivers approached Washington's tank, his uniform immaculate despite the muddy conditions. As one of the highest-ranking black officers in the European theater, Rivers carried himself with impeccable professionalism, aware that he and his men were constantly under scrutiny. "Staff Sergeant, gather your crew," Rivers ordered. "Final briefing in 5 minutes." Washington assembled his 5-man crew alongside the other tank commanders. The 761st had started with 69 tanks when they entered combat in November 1944. Now, after nearly 6 months of continuous fighting, they were down to 61 operational tanks, an impressive survival rate that spoke to their skill and discipline. "Gentlemen," Rivers began, his voice carrying across the assembled soldiers, "intelligence indicates light to moderate resistance in Pforzheim. The 254th German Infantry Regiment is dug in along these 3 ridgelines. He pointed to a detailed map. They're understrength and undersupplied, but desperate men fight hard. Our objective is to secure the town by nightfall with minimal civilian casualties. Rivers paused, making eye contact with each tank commander. You all know what the locals have been told about us. The Nazi propaganda machine has been working overtime. Expect civilians to be terrified. Your conduct upon entering this town will be beyond reproach. You are United States Army soldiers first and foremost. Demonstrate through your actions what that truly means. Washington and his fellow soldiers nodded solemnly. They had heard the intercepted German broadcasts, seen the translated pamphlets depicting them as savages. It wasn't new. They had faced similar propaganda in France and Belgium, though rarely as vicious as what the Germans had produced. One more thing, Rivers added. Intelligence reports severe food shortages among the civilian population. Many are near starvation. Each tank crew will carry additional K rations for potential humanitarian distribution, but only after the town is secured. Questions? There were none. Each man knew his duty. As Washington returned to his crew, he caught sight of war correspondent Robert Matthews scribbling in his notebook. The Pittsburgh Courier had sent Matthews to document the achievements of the 761st, providing rare media coverage for the Black Unit when most mainstream American newspapers ignored their contributions. "Getting your story ready, Matthews?" Washington called. "Always, Sergeant," the journalist replied with a grin. "Though half the time, my editors back home think I'm embellishing. No one wants to believe what you boys are actually accomplishing out here." "Just tell it straight," Washington said. "That's all we ask." Matthews nodded. "Speaking of which, mind if I ride with your crew today? I want to document the liberation up close." Washington hesitated only briefly. "Squeeze in behind Davis. Just don't touch anything that looks important." As the tanks of the 761st prepared to move out, the residents of Pforzheim huddled in their homes and makeshift shelters. Among them was Margareta Steiner, a 34-year-old widow whose husband had died at Stalingrad 2 years earlier, leaving her to raise their 10-year-old daughter, Elsa, alone. Their once comfortable middle-class life had deteriorated as the war dragged on. Now they survived on rapidly dwindling rations and whatever Margaret could barter with neighbors. "Mutti, are the Americans coming today?" Elsa asked, her thin face pale with hunger and fear. She clutched a worn teddy bear, one of the few possessions they had not burned for heat during the bitter winter. "Yes, Liebling," Margarete answered carefully. "But we will stay in the cellar until it is safe. Frau Weber says the Negro soldiers eat children," Elsa whispered, her eyes wide. She heard it on the radio. Margareta hesitated. She had heard the broadcasts too, had seen the posters depicting black American soldiers as barely human monsters intent on pillage and worse. But her late husband had been a professor before the war, with colleagues who had traveled to America. He had always scoffed at the regime's racial theories, though only in the privacy of their home. "You must not believe everything you hear," she told her daughter firmly. "Remember what Papa used to say about propaganda. That it's when the government tells big lies so often that people believe them," Elsa recited dutifully. "Yes, now pack one small bag with your most important things. We may need to leave quickly." Across town, Mayor Friedrich Hoffmann faced a terrible dilemma. At 61, he had survived the Great War, the Depression, and had navigated the Nazi regime's demands while trying to protect his town's citizens as much as possible. Now, with American forces hours away, he had received conflicting orders. "The district commander insists we defend to the last man," explained Captain Brecht, who had come to the town hall for a final coordination. "All males between 16 and 60 are to be mobilized for the Volkssturm." Hoffmann removed his spectacles, polishing them with a handkerchief to buy time for his thoughts. "Captain, we have perhaps 200 old men and boys who can barely shoot. The town's food reserves are gone. Over 400 civilians died in the February bombing. What exactly would we be defending?" "I have my orders, Herr Bürgermeister," Brecht replied stiffly. "And what of these reports about the American Negro troops? Are they accurate?" Hoffmann asked. Brecht's expression revealed nothing. "The Reich's information services are clear on the matter. Yet I notice your family evacuated to Switzerland last month," Hoffmann observed quietly. The captain's jaw tightened. My wife's health required it. Indeed, Hoffman nodded. Well, I must see to the civilians. Good day, Captain. After Brecht left, Hoffman summoned his most trusted assistant, Hans Becker. At 55, Becker had managed to avoid party membership throughout the Nazi era through his indispensable administrative skills. Hans quietly spread the word. No Volkssturm mobilization. Tell families to hide any weapons and remove any Nazi insignia from their homes, and find white sheets or tablecloths, anything that could serve as a surrender flag. But the district commander's orders, Becker began. We'll get everyone killed for nothing, Hoffman interrupted. The war is lost, we all know it. My responsibility is to the living, not to the Reich's death throes. As morning gave way to midday, the first shells from American artillery began landing on the German defensive positions outside Pforzheim. Captain Brecht watched grimly as the systematic barrage walked closer to his front lines. They're shelling precisely. Someone's giving them good coordinates, Müller observed. Brecht nodded. Our defenses aren't exactly invisible, Sergeant. The radio operator, a teenager with a wispy attempt at a mustache, called urgently from his foxhole. Captain, command reports American tanks breaking through at Neuenberg. They'll be on our flank in an hour. Impossible, Brecht replied. The bridges were demolished. They've brought bridge-building units, sir. The 761st tanks are already crossing. Brecht reassessed his increasingly untenable position. His orders were to hold until reinforcements arrived from the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, but those same reinforcements had been promised for 3 days. Prepare for a fighting withdrawal, he finally ordered. We'll delay them at the river crossing, then fall back to the urban defensive positions. And the civilian evacuation order? Müller asked. Brecht's expression darkened. There is no evacuation order. The civilians remain in place. Inside the town, rumors spread rapidly. American tanks approaching. Black soldiers leading the advance. Destruction imminent. Margareta Steiner listened to the whispered conversations in the crowded cellar, where several neighboring families had gathered. My cousin in Mannheim said they took everything, one woman insisted. Food, jewelry, even wedding rings. I heard worse, another whispered, glancing meaningfully at the women present. An elderly man who had fought in the previous war spoke up. The French used their colonial troops to terrify us in the Rhineland occupation. The Americans are doing the same with their Negroes. It's psychological warfare. Margaret held Elsa closer, uncertain what to believe. The distant thunder of artillery grew louder, punctuated occasionally by the sharper crack of tank cannons. Above them, the first American tanks reached the outskirts of Pforzheim. Washington's Sherman led the second platoon down the main approach road, advancing cautiously between bomb-damaged buildings. Eyes sharp, Davis, Washington instructed his gunner. Germans love to hide anti-tank guns in rubble. Movement at 2 o'clock, Davis reported tensely. Second floor window, red brick building. Washington peered through his vision block. Hold fire, that's a civilian. White sheet in the window. Indeed, white sheets and tablecloths had begun appearing in windows throughout the town, a grassroots surrender orchestrated by Mayor Hoffman in defiance of Nazi orders. Not everyone complied. Some windows remained shuttered. Their occupants either loyal to the regime until the end, or simply too frightened to signal either way. The German defensive withdrawal quickly disintegrated into isolated pockets of resistance. Captain Brecht found himself with only 11 men in a makeshift command post as American tanks methodically cleared the town's periphery. The Volkssturm never assembled, a blood-spattered messenger informed him. Mayor Hoffman countermanded the order. Treasonous bastard, Brecht muttered, though without real conviction. Part of him had expected this. Another part, the part that remembered Germany before Hitler, was relieved. "Sir, what are our orders?" asked Corporal Weber, looking desperately young under his oversized helmet. Brecht surveyed the frightened faces of his remaining men. Most were untested in urban combat. All were exhausted and hungry. To sacrifice them now, with the war clearly lost, seemed pointless. "The following is my final order as your commanding officer," Brecht stated formally. "You are to remove your uniform jackets and equipment, conceal your weapons, but do not discard them. Disperse in groups of no more than 2. Make your way home if possible. The Reich no longer commands your loyalty." "Sir?" Weber looked stunned. "Is that surrender?" "That is survival, Corporal," Brecht replied. "Sometimes it is the only victory available." As his men dispersed, Brecht placed his Walter pistol on the table, removed his Iron Cross and officer's insignia, and waited. Within 20 minutes, the distinctive rumble of a Sherman tank approached his position. Washington's tank had just rounded a corner when Davis spotted the white flag hanging from the command post window. "Possible surrender, 2 o'clock, he reported. "Approach with caution," Washington ordered. "Matthews, stay inside." The war correspondent ignored him, camera ready. "History in the making. Sergeant." With infantry support from the 92nd Division, Washington approached the building carefully. 2 American soldiers kicked in the door, rifles ready. "One German officer, unarmed," came the shout moments later. Brecht was escorted outside, hands raised. He registered momentary surprise upon seeing Washington, but maintained his military bearing. "I am Hauptmann Werner Brecht, 254th Infantry Regiment," he stated in accented English. "I wish to surrender my person and declare Pforzheim an open city." Washington studied the German captain carefully before responding. "Staff Sergeant James Washington, 761st Tank Battalion, United States Army. Your surrender is accepted." As Brecht was taken to the battalion's temporary prisoner processing center, Matthews snapped several photographs of the German officer speaking with Washington, images that would later feature prominently in his courier coverage. By mid-afternoon, the Americans had secured most of Pforzheim with minimal resistance. Mayor Hoffman met Colonel Rivers at the town hall, officially surrendering the town and providing critical information about remaining German positions, unexploded ordnance from previous Allied bombing, and the desperate civilian situation. "Our food reserves were depleted weeks ago," Hoffman explained. "Many are suffering from malnutrition, especially the children and elderly." Rivers nodded, making notes. "We'll coordinate with civil affairs units. In the meantime, I can authorize emergency rations distribution from our own supplies." The mayor seemed surprised by this immediate offer of assistance. "That is most generous, Colonel." "It's standard procedure," Rivers replied evenly, recognizing the Germans' unspoken assumptions. Washington's tank crew was assigned to secure the town's central square. As they established their position, curious and frightened faces began appearing in windows, studying the black soldiers with a mixture of fear, curiosity, and desperate hope. "They look like they expected monsters," observed Private Henry Jefferson, Washington's loader. "They did," Matthews said, still scribbling notes. "Look at this." He handed Jefferson a crumpled propaganda leaflet he'd found, depicting grotesque caricatures of black soldiers committing atrocities. Jefferson stared at the image, his expression hardening. "Nothing we haven't seen before. Different language, same garbage." "Different is they actually believed it," Washington pointed out. "That old woman across the street is literally hiding her granddaughter behind her skirts. Check her face. Now, that's not just fear of Americans. That's fear of us specifically." The crew fell silent, understanding the unique position they occupied. They were simultaneously liberators, conquerors, and the physical embodiment of the racial terror Nazi propaganda had used to frighten Germans for years. The standoff might have continued indefinitely had hunger not intervened. A small girl, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, broke away from her grandmother's grasp and approached Washington's tank. Painfully thin, with blonde braids and a worn dress several sizes too small, she stared up at Jefferson, who had been distributing K-rations to his crewmates. "Bitte. Essen?" she asked hesitantly, pointing at the food. "Please." "Food?" Jefferson froze, chocolate bar in hand, looking to Washington for guidance. "Go ahead." Washington nodded. "But approach slowly." Jefferson carefully came down from the tank, crouched to the girl's level and offered her the chocolate. "Here you go, little miss," he said gently. The child snatched the bar, examined it briefly, then looked back up at Jefferson with wide eyes. "Danke," she whispered before running back to her grandmother, proudly displaying her prize. The elderly woman looked stunned, glancing between the chocolate and the black soldier who had given it. Slowly, hesitantly, she nodded in acknowledgement. "Might be the first time she's ever thanked a black man for anything," Jefferson observed quietly. "Might be the first time she's ever seen a black man," Washington replied. The simple exchange broke the ice. Within minutes, other children appeared, drawn by word of chocolate. Behind them came mothers and grandmothers, hollow-eyed with hunger, but determined to obtain food for their families. Washington organized his crew to distribute their personal rations systematically, ensuring the most vulnerable received something. Matthews documented everything, his camera capturing the moment when a black American soldier handed a K-ration to a German mother, whose face transformed from terror to tearful gratitude. In her cellar refuge, Margareta Steiner heard the commotion above. German children's voices, talking excitedly about food. American voices responding in English. No screams, no shots. "What's happening, Mutti?" Elsa asked. "I'm not sure," Margaret replied, "but I think it might be safe to look." Cautiously, she led her daughter up the cellar stairs and peered outside. The scene that greeted her defied everything Goebbels' propaganda had prepared her to expect. Black American soldiers were distributing food to a growing crowd of German civilians. One soldier had hoisted a laughing child onto his shoulders. Another was demonstrating how to open the unfamiliar K-ration packaging. "They're giving away food," Elsa whispered in awe. "Yes," Margaret said, her worldview shifting uncomfortably. "Yes, they are." Swallowing her fear, she took her daughter's hand and joined the crowd. Captain Werner Brecht sat in the American Processing Center, awaiting transfer to a proper prisoner of war camp. Across from him sat Lieutenant William Morris of Military Intelligence, a light-skinned black officer, whose presence clearly unsettled the German captain. "Your propaganda ministry has been quite busy, Captain," Morris observed, placing several German leaflets on the table between them. Each depicted black American soldiers as bestial, violent predators. "What were you told to expect from units like the 761st? Brecht studied the leaflets, then met Morris's gaze directly. "We were told they were untrained, undisciplined, and violent, that they would harm civilians, that they were inferior soldiers." "And yet here we are," Morris replied evenly. "Here we are," Brecht agreed. After a pause, he added, "The Eastern Front taught me to distinguish between propaganda and reality, Lieutenant. Unfortunately, most civilians haven't had that." Education. As evening approached, Colonel Rivers organized a more formal distribution center in Pforzheim's town hall. Civil affairs officers catalogued the civilian population, while medical personnel identified the most vulnerable cases of malnutrition. The 761st's tanks took up defensive positions around the town perimeter, preparing for the possibility of a German counterattack that both sides knew would never come. Washington found Matthews sitting on a damaged fountain in the town square, reviewing his notes and photographs. "Getting your story, Matthews?" Washington asked. The journalist nodded, though I'm not sure if anyone back home will believe it. "Black soldiers save starving Germantown" isn't the narrative most editors are looking for. What are they looking for? Something that confirms what they already believe, Matthews shrugged. About Germans, about Negro soldiers, about the war? The truth is always more complicated. Washington glanced around the square, where German civilians and American soldiers continued their cautious interactions. "You know what's strangest to me? These people spent years being told we were barely human. Their government literally classified us as subhuman. Yet after a few hours and some chocolate bars, they're looking at us like we're their saviors." "Hunger is a powerful reality check," Matthews observed, "and fear only works until it's contradicted by experience." At the distribution center, Margareta Steiner waited patiently in line with Elsa. When they finally reached the front, they found themselves facing Sergeant Marcus Davis, who smiled kindly at them. "Name?" he asked, pencil poised above his clipboard. "Margareta Steiner, and my daughter Elsa," she replied in careful English. Davis nodded, making a notation. "Any medical concerns I should note?" Margaret hesitated, studying Davis's face, his humanity so evident, so contrary to everything the Reich had told her to expect. "My daughter has had little protein for months. The rations. I understand, Davis interrupted gently. We've got medical personnel who can check her, and we'll make sure you both get proper food tonight. As he handed them each a ration pack, Elsa looked up at him with curious eyes. Why are you helping us? The radio said you would hurt us. Davis crouched to her level. Because that's not who we are, little one, and it's not what soldiers are supposed to do. Margaret felt tears welling in her eyes, not just from relief at the food, but from the profound realization of how thoroughly she had been deceived. She remembered her husband's warnings about propaganda, his insistence that the regime's racial theories were nonsense. How right he had been. Danke, she whispered to Davis. Thank you. As night fell over Pforzheim, the first day of American occupation ended without a single civilian casualty. Washington's crew settled into their assigned observation post, rotating watch duties through the night. Similar scenes unfolded across the European theater as the Allied advance continued inexorably toward Berlin. Yet in this small German town, something remarkable was happening, a mutual recognition of shared humanity that directly contradicted years of calculated dehumanization. Matthews captured it in his final notes for the day. In Pforzheim today, I witnessed the most effective weapon against Nazi racial ideology, the simple, everyday decency of Negro soldiers who, through nothing more complex than being themselves, shattered a carefully constructed lie. Tomorrow, these same German civilians who trembled at the thought of black American troops will queue for rations, exchange awkward greetings, and begin the long process of unlearning hatred. It is a small victory in the larger war, perhaps, but one with implications that may outlast many battlefield triumphs. Dawn broke over Pforzheim on April 19, 1945, revealing a town transformed not just by war's destruction, but by an unexpected occupation. The tanks of the 761st Battalion stood sentinel at key intersections, their black crews rotating shifts as German civilians cautiously emerged from their homes. Outside the town hall, a line had already formed. Mothers, children, and elderly men waiting for the promised food distribution to resume. The initial terror that had greeted the arrival of black American soldiers had given way to something more complex, a wary gratitude born of hunger satisfied and propaganda contradicted. What no one yet realized, neither the Americans nor the Germans, was that this small Schwarzwald town was becoming the stage for a profound unraveling of racial myths that would spread far beyond its bomb-damaged streets. Sergeant Washington emerged from his tank after a fitful night's sleep, stretching muscles stiff from the confined space. The morning air carried the acrid scent of burnt buildings mixed with the earthy dampness of early spring. He noticed the growing civilian line and the tentative glances cast toward him and his crew. "They're still trying to figure us out," observed Private Jefferson, handing Washington a steaming cup of coffee from their rations. Washington nodded. "Can't blame them. Spent years being told we're monsters. Then we show up with chocolate bars instead of horns and tails." Speaking of chocolate, Jefferson said, "Supply trucks are due at Oro 900. Colonel Rivers wants us to maintain the perimeter security while the 92nd handles distribution." "Good. Our boys need rest more than they need to play Santa Claus." Washington surveyed the town square. "Though I admit, seeing their faces when they realized we weren't going to eat their babies, that was something." The two men shared a grim laugh, the kind that acknowledged the absurdity while recognizing the deeper injustice beneath it. Across town, in her small apartment, Margareta Steiner was making a momentous decision. She carefully unfolded a white blouse, one of the few nice items she had preserved through the war years, and laid it on her bed alongside a skirt that had belonged to her mother. "Mutti, why are you wearing your good clothes?" Elsa asked, watching from the doorway. "Because we are going to volunteer at the distribution center," Margaret answered, her tone brooking no argument. "Those American soldiers helped us when they didn't have to. Now we will help them communicate with our neighbors." Elsa's eyes widened. "But what will people say? Frau Weber already called you a traitor just for taking their food." Margaret's expression hardened. "Frau Weber's husband was SS. She can say what she wishes. We will do what is right." At the temporary American headquarters, Colonel Rivers was conferring with Captain Howard Milligan from Civil Affairs. Reviewing the situation in Pforzheim, Population approximately 4. 200 remaining civilians, Milligan reported. Pre-war numbers were around 65, EWO00, but between evacuations and the February bombing. He let the sentence trail off. The February 23rd Allied bombing raid had devastated Pforzheim, killing nearly 20% of its population in a single night. Rivers nodded grimly. What's their food situation? Critical, no deliveries in 3 weeks. Local stores were depleted months ago. They've been surviving on whatever they could grow or barter. And medical? 1 doctor for the entire town. No antibiotics, limited surgical supplies. We've identified 17 urgent cases needing evacuation to our field hospital. Rivers made a notation on his clipboard. Coordinate with Lieutenant Carroll for transportation. Priority to children and the elderly. Yes, sir. Milligan hesitated before adding, there's also the matter of integration. Rivers looked up sharply. Explain. Some of the white units arriving this morning, they're not accustomed to working alongside Negro troops. There have been some comments. What kind of comments, Captain? Rivers' voice remained even, but his eyes hardened. Milligan shifted uncomfortably. Suggestions that your men should handle perimeter security only. That civilian interaction should be managed by white soldiers to avoid complications. I see. Rivers set down his clipboard. Captain, the 761st has been in continuous combat for 173 days. We've suffered 156 casualties and received 391 decorations for valor. My men have liberated towns across France, Belgium, and Germany. They will continue performing all duties as directed by Theatre Command, which has placed this town under my authority. Of course, sir, Milligan replied quickly. I merely thought you should be aware of potential friction. I've been aware of potential friction my entire life, Captain, Rivers said dryly. Manage your men accordingly. At the food distribution center, Robert Matthews continued documenting the developing story. His camera captured German children watching wide-eyed as Black American soldiers unloaded supplies, German women hesitantly accepting rations with murmured thanks, and the gradual relaxation of rigid boundaries as basic human interaction overcame programmed fear. Mind if I join you? A voice asked in German-accented English. Matthews turned to find Margareta Steiner standing nearby, now dressed in her best clothes, her daughter half hidden behind her skirts. Of course, Matthews replied, surprised. You speak English very well. My husband was a professor of literature before the war, she explained. He insisted we speak English at home on Thursdays. A shadow crossed her face. He died at Stalingrad. I'm sorry, Matthews said. After a pause, he asked, May I ask why you're here? Most civilians are just taking their rations and hurrying home. Margaret straightened her shoulders. I wish to volunteer as an interpreter. Many here speak no English, and there is much confusion. Fear I can help explain things. Matthews studied her thoughtfully. That's courageous of you. Not everyone will approve. No, she agreed simply. They will not. He introduced her to Lieutenant Franklin, who was overseeing the distribution. The young white officer looked surprised, but quickly recognized the value of having a local volunteer who spoke English. Mrs. Steiner, we'd be grateful for your assistance, Franklin said. We have particular difficulty identifying those with special dietary needs, the elderly, pregnant women, children with allergies. I can help with this, she nodded. And please, it is Frau Steiner, or simply Margaret. As she began working alongside the Americans, translating instructions and helping organize the growing crowd of civilians, Margaret became acutely aware of the changing atmosphere. Some of her neighbors refused to look at her, turning away as if her collaboration were contagious. Others watched with cautious interest, noting that the feared Negro soldiers treated her with unfailing courtesy. Most striking was 10-year-old Elsa's rapid adaptation. Initially shy and frightened, the girl soon began following Private Jefferson around, watching in fascination as he organized supply crates. When he noticed her interest, Jefferson taught her simple English phrases, "Thank you" and "More please" and "Good morning," which she repeated with growing confidence. By midday, a new shipment of medical supplies had arrived, accompanied by a field medical team that included Lieutenant Sarah Cohen, An army nurse whose Star of David necklace drew stares from the German civilians. Cohen worked efficiently alongside a medic from the 761st, Corporal Samuel Turner, examining malnourished children and elderly patients. "This child needs protein and vitamins immediately," Cohen told Turner as she examined a listless 6-year-old boy. "Classic signs of advanced malnutrition." Turner nodded, preparing a nutrient solution. "We're seeing too many like him. 3 years of reduced rations, then near starvation these past months." Margaret, translating nearby, heard the exchange and approached hesitantly. "Excuse me, but there are others, hidden ones, in worse condition." Cohen looked up. "Hidden ones?" "Yes." Margaret lowered her voice. "Jewish families and others who have been in hiding. Some have not been outside in years." Cohen and Turner exchanged glances. "How many?" Turner asked. "I know of 3 families, perhaps 15 people total. There may be others." Cohen made a quick decision. "Take us to them. Bring extra rations," she told Turner. To Margaret, she added, "Will anyone try to stop us?" "Some neighbors know. They have kept the secret. Others, it would be better if they don't see." Turner gathered supplies while Cohen informed her commanding officer. Within 20 minutes, they were following Margaret through narrow back streets, avoiding main thoroughfares where curious eyes might track their movements. They reached a nondescript house with boarded windows. Margaret knocked in a distinctive pattern. 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 more. After a long silence, they heard the sound of furniture being moved. Then the door opened a crack. An elderly man peered out, his sunken eyes widening at the sight of the American uniforms. He began to close the door in panic, until Margaret spoke rapidly in German, explaining their purpose. Finally, he admitted them to a dimly lit interior. In the basement, they found 2 families, 11 people total, living in conditions that shocked even the battle-hardened Americans. The space was divided into tiny sleeping areas by hanging blankets. A crude toilet had been fashioned in one corner. The occupants were desperately thin, their skin sallow from years without sunlight. "Mein Gott," Margaret whispered, clearly seeing the hidden families for the first time. "I knew they were here, but I never—" "You helped them?" Cohen asked as Turner began examining a frail, elderly woman. "Not I personally," Margaret admitted. "My neighbor, Herr Becker, the mayor's assistant, he organized a network. Some of us contributed food when we could, but in recent months there has been so little." One of the hidden residents, a middle-aged man named David Bergman, spoke up in careful English. "We have survived on potato peelings and water for weeks. The children—" He gestured to 3 hollow-eyed children huddled together on a thin mattress. While Turner and Cohen tended to the most critical cases, Margaret explained to the Americans how these families had survived the Nazi regime's persecution. Some had lived in Pforzheim before the war, but went into hiding when deportations began. Others had fled from larger cities, seeking refuge in the smaller town where enforcement was sometimes less rigorous. Herr Becker falsified records, created ration cards, she explained. When the Gestapo came, he diverted them, but it became more dangerous as the war continued. 2 families were discovered last year. They were taken away. "And the townspeople?" Cohen asked. "How many knew?" "More than would admit it," Margaret replied quietly. "We did not speak of it, even among ourselves, but bread would appear, or medicine. Small things." As they worked, Matthews documented the scene with his camera, though he promised Cohen he would not publish any photographs that might identify the hidden families or their protectors. "This story needs to be told," he insisted, "but safely." By evening, 5 hidden families had been located throughout Pforzheim. Colonel Rivers established a secure recovery center in a requisitioned school building, where they could receive proper medical care while maintaining their privacy until decisions about their future could be made. The discovery of the hidden families created a new dynamic in the occupied town. The German civilians who had protected them now found common cause with the American liberators, while those who had supported the regime or simply looked away grew increasingly uncomfortable as their complicity became evident. At the temporary American headquarters, Captain Brecht had been summoned for additional questioning. This time, He found himself facing both Lieutenant Morris and Colonel Rivers. "We've discovered several families in hiding," Rivers said without preamble. "Jewish citizens, political dissidents, and others targeted by your regime." Brecht's expression remained neutral. "I was aware that such things occurred." "Were you aware of the network protecting them in Pforzheim?" Morris pressed. "I had suspicions," Brecht admitted. Mayor Hoffman was never enthusiastic about hunting undesirables. His assistant, Becker, disappeared whenever the SD or Gestapo visited. I chose not to investigate. "Why?" Rivers asked simply. Brecht considered the question carefully. By 1944, it was clear to anyone with military experience that Germany would lose the war. Participating in atrocities seemed pointless. "Yet you continued fighting," Morris observed. "I continued leading my men," Brecht corrected. "There's a difference." Rivers studied the German officer thoughtfully. "Captain, we're establishing a civilian administration until a permanent governance structure can be implemented. We need someone who understands both military and civilian matters to help maintain order. Mayor Hoffman has suggested you." Brecht looked genuinely surprised. "Me? I was a Wehrmacht officer. You were also, according to multiple accounts, one of the few local commanders who prevented reprisals against civilians for sabotage," Morris pointed out. "And you surrendered the town rather than fighting to the last man as ordered." After a long pause, Brecht nodded. "If I can help prevent further suffering, I will." That evening, as Washington's crew performed maintenance on their tank, they were approached by a group of German children led by Elsa Steiner. The children carried a crudely painted sign reading, "Danke," thank you, in large letters decorated with childish flowers and stars. Washington chuckled at the sight. "What's all this, then?" Elsa stepped forward bravely. "We bring you thank you," she announced in halting English, clearly coached by her mother. "For food and for being nice." The tankers exchanged glances, visibly moved by the unexpected gesture. Davis crouched down to the children's level. "You're very welcome," he said gently. "We're glad to help." "My mother says the radio tell lies about you," Elsa continued earnestly. "She says you are good men." Jefferson laughed. "Well, now, don't go spreading that around too much. We've got a reputation to maintain." The children didn't understand the joke, but smiled anyway. One small boy shyly offered Washington a treasured possession, a small wooden car, lovingly whittled despite the crude workmanship. "Oh, I couldn't take that, son," Washington protested. "Bitter," the boy insisted, "for you." Washington accepted the gift with appropriate solemnity, understanding the significance of the gesture. "Thank you, soldier," he said, offering a proper salute that made the boy beam with pride. As the children ran off to tell their families about the encounter, Matthews approached, having captured the scene with his camera. "That's going to make one hell of a photograph," the journalist commented. "German children thanking Negro soldiers after years of being told you were monsters." "If your newspaper actually prints it," Washington replied skeptically. "Oh, they'll print it. The question is whether anyone will understand what they're seeing." Matthews lit a cigarette, offering one to Washington, who declined. "This is the story no one's telling, how a bunch of black tankers from America are dismantling the entire Nazi racial worldview just by handing out chocolate bars and being decent human beings." "Don't overstate it," Washington cautioned. "These folks are grateful for food and protection. Doesn't mean their fundamental beliefs have changed." "Doesn't it?" Matthews challenged. "That woman, Frau Steiner. Yesterday she was terrified her daughter would be harmed by the very men that child just thanked for saving them. That's a profound transformation. For one woman," Washington pointed out, "one family." "It starts with one," Matthews replied. "Always does." Later that night, in the school building where the hidden families were being cared for, Lieutenant Cohen found herself engaged in an unexpected conversation with David Bergman. The middle-aged former accountant had survived 3 years in hiding, losing his wife to pneumonia during their second winter in the basement. "Your soldiers, the Negro ones," Bergman said hesitantly. "They are treated equally in America." Cohen hesitated, unwilling to lie but equally unwilling to diminish the reality of what black Americans had accomplished despite discrimination. They serve with honor in our military, she said carefully. But no, they don't have full equality. Bergman nodded thoughtfully. Yet they fight for America. And they treat us, even Germans who have been their enemies, with humanity. They do, Cohen agreed. It is a powerful testimony, Bergman observed, more powerful perhaps than they realize. The next morning brought significant developments to Pforzheim. Additional American units arrived, including elements of the 14th Armored Division, whose white soldiers had not previously worked alongside black units. The potential for friction that Captain Milligan had warned about quickly materialized. As Washington supervised his crew refueling their tank, a white sergeant from the 14th approached, visibly uncomfortable with the task he'd been assigned. "You the ranking NCO here?" he asked Washington. "That's right. Staff Sergeant Washington, 761st. The sergeant nodded stiffly. "Sergeant Miller, 14th Armored. My company's taking over this sector. You boys are being reassigned to perimeter security." Washington's expression didn't change, but his tone cooled perceptibly. "By whose order, Sergeant?" "Captain Lawson, my company commander." "Interesting. Colonel Rivers placed us here specifically. Perhaps your captain should discuss changes with him directly." Miller flushed. "Look, it's nothing personal. It's just that we've got civilians to manage and—" "And what, Sergeant?" Washington interrupted. "You think they haven't seen black soldiers before? We've been here 2 days already. That's different. Initial occupation is one thing, but for ongoing administration—" Miller trailed off, aware he was venturing into dangerous territory. "I think you'd better take this up through proper channels," Washington said firmly. "Until then, my men remain at their assigned posts." The confrontation might have escalated had Matthews not arrived, camera conspicuously in hand. The white sergeant, unwilling to have the exchange documented, retreated with a muttered comment about checking with command. "Problem?" Matthews asked Washington. "Same old problem, different day," Washington replied wearily. "New units coming in, trying to push us to the background now that the fighting's done." This incident, while relatively minor, represented a pivotal moment in Pforzheim's occupation. When Colonel Rivers learned of Captain Lawson's attempt to reassign the 761st without proper authorization, he called an immediate meeting of all unit commanders. "Gentlemen," Rivers began, his voice deceptively mild, "I want to clarify the command structure in Pforzheim. This town is currently under the authority of the 761st Battalion and associated elements of the 92nd Infantry Division. Additional units will coordinate through my headquarters. Is that understood?" The white officers nodded, though several looked uncomfortable. Captain Lawson spoke up. "With respect, Colonel, my understanding from division was that we would be assuming administrative control as you moved forward." "Your understanding is incorrect, Captain," Rivers replied flatly. "The 761st remains in Pforzheim for the time being. We established relations with the civilian population, we identified the hidden families, and we will continue our mission until properly relieved by division order." The message was clear. The black units would not be sidelined now that the dangerous work was done. This stance, unusual for the segregated American military of 1945, reflected Rivers' determination to ensure his men received appropriate recognition for their accomplishments. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through Pforzheim, observed with interest by both American soldiers and German civilians. For many Germans, it provided an unexpected insight into American society, revealing that the nation fighting for democracy still struggled with its own racial hierarchies. Margaret Steiner, continuing her volunteer work at the distribution center, found herself explaining this dynamic to curious German women who had begun asking increasingly direct questions about the black soldiers. If they fight so bravely, why does their own army treat them differently? Asked Frau Müller, a baker's wife who had gradually overcome her initial terror of the black Americans. America has its own complicated history with race, Margareta explained, drawing on her late husband's knowledge of American society. Not so different from our own prejudices, perhaps. But they are so kind to our children, marveled another woman. Herr Goebbels said they would harm them. Herr Goebbels said many things, Margaret replied dryly. How many proved true? This growing recognition that Nazi propaganda had lied not just about black Americans but about many things, spread through Pforzheim like a quiet revelation. Small acts of cooperation and gratitude multiplied. German women began offering to wash American soldiers' uniforms. Children brought wildflowers to the distribution center. One elderly craftsman presented Colonel Rivers with an intricately carved chess set as thanks for medical treatment provided to his wife. Most significantly, more Germans began coming forward with information about hidden families, Nazi officials still in hiding, and weapons caches that needed securing. The wall of silence that typically greeted occupying forces began to crumble in Pforzheim, replaced by a tentative trust built on shared humanity. Captain Brecht, working alongside the American authorities, provided crucial insights into local power structures and potential trouble spots. His cooperation earned him the enmity of die-hard Nazi supporters, but gained him respect from both the Americans and the majority of civilians who simply wanted peace and stability. "You surprise me, Captain," Colonel Rivers commented after Brecht helped defuse a potentially volatile confrontation with former Hitler Youth members who had planned to sabotage an American supply truck. "Why?" Brecht asked. "Because I choose peace over pointless destruction?" "Because you work willingly with us," Rivers clarified. "With me specifically." Brecht considered this. "Before the war, I studied engineering at university. I had a professor who had worked in America, in Detroit. He spoke of Negro engineers and inventors with respect. When the regime's racial theories became law, I remembered his words and wondered." "And now?" Rivers prompted. "Now I know he was right to question," Brecht said simply, "and I was a fool not to question more." By the fourth day of occupation, a remarkable transformation had occurred in Pforzheim. The fear that had initially greeted the black American soldiers had largely dissipated, replaced by a complex mix of gratitude, curiosity, and respect. German children followed Washington's tankers around town, peppering them with questions about America and their powerful Sherman tank. German women brought freshly baked bread to the distribution center, insisting the soldiers take some despite their own scarcity. Most striking was the change in how the hidden families were treated once their existence became public knowledge. Rather than the shame or rejection they had feared, many townspeople now openly acknowledged their role in the protection network or expressed regret at not having helped. "It is as if permission has been granted to be human again," Mayor Hoffman observed to Matthews. "The regime demanded we see others as less than human, Jews, foreigners, anyone different. Now we remember they are our neighbors." "And the black American soldiers?" Matthews asked. "How has the town's perception of them changed?" Hoffman smiled wryly. "Perhaps the greatest irony of Hitler's Reich is that those he labeled Untermenschen, subhuman, have proven the most humane. It is a powerful lesson for those willing to learn it." For Washington and his crew, the experience of Pforzheim represented something equally profound. Accustomed to fighting prejudice in both enemy territory and within their own army, they found themselves in the unprecedented position of being respected for both their military prowess and their basic humanity. "Never thought I'd see German children asking for my autograph," Jefferson remarked incredulously after a group of boys had presented him with a homemade American flag featuring too few stars but earnest good wishes. "Never thought I'd see German women thanking us for liberating them instead of hiding in their cellars," Davis added. "Don't get too comfortable," Washington cautioned. "We move out tomorrow. The 14th takes over administration." "Think it'll last?" Jefferson asked. "This, whatever it is that's happening here." Washington considered the question seriously. "The food will run out. The gratitude might too. But some things, once seen, can't be unseen. They spent years being told we were animals, and now they know different. That knowledge doesn't just disappear." On their final evening in Pforzheim, Colonel Rivers organized a small ceremony in the town square. The remains of the 761st Battalion and attached units assembled in formation, their vehicles freshly cleaned despite the mud that seemed permanently embedded in the German countryside that spring. The townspeople gathered to watch, no longer fearful but still somewhat uncertain about this formal American ritual. Rivers, immaculate in his dress uniform, addressed both his soldiers and the German civilians through an interpreter, Margarete Steiner, who had emerged as an essential bridge between the occupiers and occupied. "Tomorrow we continue our advance," Rivers stated, his voice carrying across the square. "The 14th Armored Division will assume responsibility for Pforzheim's administration and security. They are good soldiers who will maintain the peace we have established." He paused, surveying the assembled Germans. "In 5 days we have accomplished something remarkable here, not just the liberation of a town, but the beginning of understanding. My men came as soldiers. You received them as liberators. Together, we have shown that humanity can transcend the artificial barriers of race and nationality that have caused so much suffering." As Margarete translated, her voice occasionally catching with emotion, Rivers continued, "Some of you feared these men because of their skin color. You had been told they were monsters. Instead, you found them sharing their rations, treating your sick, protecting your children. Remember this lesson when you begin rebuilding your society. Judge people by their actions, not by propaganda, by their character, not by their appearance." The ceremony concluded with the American flag being raised over the town hall, a symbolic transfer of authority that would be repeated in countless German towns that spring. As the soldiers dispersed, Washington found himself approached by Elsa Steiner and her mother. "We wanted to say goodbye," Margarete explained, her daughter clutching her hand tightly, "and thank you again." "Just doing our job, ma'am," Washington replied with a small smile. "It was more than that," Margarete insisted. "You must know that." Washington nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind her words. "What will you do now?" "Rebuild," she said simply. "And remember." Elsa stepped forward suddenly, offering Washington a small package wrapped in newspaper. "For you," she said proudly in her newly practiced English, "to remember us." Inside the crude wrapping, Washington found a family photograph in a simple wooden frame. Margarete, a man who must have been her husband, and a younger Elsa smiled from what looked like happier times before the war. "I can't accept this," Washington protested. "It's your family. We have others," Margarete assured him. "This one is for you, so you remember that not all Germans believed the lies." Washington carefully tucked the photo into his kit bag. "Thank you, I won't forget." The next morning, as the tanks of the 761st prepared to depart, the streets of Pforzheim filled with German civilians. Many brought small gifts, flowers, hand-carved trinkets, precious food they could ill afford to share. Children ran alongside the rumbling vehicles, waving and calling out the English phrases they had learned. Matthews, riding atop Washington's tank as he had upon their arrival, continued documenting the scene. "Quite a difference from when we rolled in," he observed. "Night and day," Washington agreed, waving to several children he recognized. As they reached the town limits, Washington ordered his driver to pause briefly. Looking back at Pforzheim, its damaged buildings and hungry civilians now familiar to him in ways he never expected, he found himself reflecting on the strange alchemy that had transformed fear into something approaching friendship in less than a week. "You know what the real propaganda victory was here?" Matthews asked, somehow following Washington's thoughts. "Not just showing Germans that black men aren't monsters. It was showing everyone, Germans, other American units, maybe even ourselves, that humanity is stronger than hatred if given half a chance." Washington nodded slowly. "Maybe so, though I'm not sure how many people will believe that part of the story." "That's why I'm writing it," Matthews grinned. "Someone has to document what really happened in Pforzheim, how the Black Panthers didn't just liberate a town, they liberated minds." With that, Washington signaled the advance, and the tanks of the 761st moved forward toward their next objective, leaving behind a town forever changed by their brief presence. In the weeks and months that followed, Pforzheim began the long process of physical and psychological reconstruction. Under Mayor Hoffmann's leadership, and with Captain Brecht's assistance, the civilian administration gradually stabilized. Food supplies improved as American logistics operations extended into the conquered territories. The hidden families emerged fully into public life, many choosing to remain in the town where neighbors had protected them at great personal risk. Margaret Steiner continued her role as an interpreter for the American authorities, eventually establishing a small English-language school where German children learned not just a new language, but a new way of seeing the world beyond their borders. Her daughter Elsa, profoundly influenced by her encounters with the Black American soldiers, would later write a memoir titled The Men Who Were Not Monsters, documenting her childhood experiences during those pivotal days in April 1945. For the men of the 761st Tank Battalion, Pforzheim became a bittersweet memory amid the larger struggles of war and its aftermath. They would fight on until Germany's surrender, then return to an America still grappling with its own racial divisions. Many would participate in the civil rights movements of the following decades, drawing strength from the knowledge that they had not just fought fascism abroad, but had demonstrated the fundamental falsehood of racial hierarchy through their own dignity and humanity. The story of what happened in Pforzheim might have remained a footnote in the vast narrative of World War II had it not been for Robert Matthews' persistent reporting. His articles for the Pittsburgh Courier, accompanied by powerful photographs of Black American soldiers sharing rations with German children, eventually reached a wider audience through republication in several mainstream newspapers, a small but significant crack in the segregated media landscape of post-war America. One photograph in particular gained iconic status: a Black American sergeant kneeling to offer chocolate to a small blonde German girl, while her mother watched with tears streaming down her face. The caption, drawn from Matthews' reporting, read simply, "The moment propaganda died in Pforzheim." The image would be reproduced in history textbooks decades later as a powerful visual representation of how human connection can transcend even the most deeply entrenched hatreds. In 1965, 20 years after the liberation of Pforzheim, Staff Sergeant James Washington, now a civil rights activist in Detroit, received an unexpected letter with German postage. Inside was a wedding invitation from Elsa Steiner, the little girl he remembered from those April days in 1945. She was marrying an American exchange student she had met at university and wanted Washington to attend as an honored guest. "You changed my life," and she wrote. "You showed me that everything I had been taught about human differences was a lie. That knowledge shaped everything that came after. My town never forgot what you and your men did, not just liberating us, but treating us with dignity when we expected monstrosity. That lesson echoes still." Washington made the journey to Germany, where he found a rebuilt Pforzheim and a generation of young Germans who had been raised on stories about the Black American soldiers who had shared their rations when they could have sought revenge. The old propaganda had not just failed, it had been transformed into its opposite, a powerful reminder of how humanity can emerge even from the darkest chapters of history. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.